Hey all, so back with another Spotlight with Context. Today we are talking about Bullseye, the newest skill roadblock defender. And so let's get right into it. Bullseye has pretty solid prestige. 18280 is, I think, 11th, maybe tied for 11th. We'll see when that comes out on Aunt May, since those numbers tend to be a little bit different than the ones that give us these tables here. Moving on to the champion attributes, 3 survivability is pretty fair. The evade in Bullseye's kit is a pretty potent weapon, definitely helps you get out of some tough spots. He also has some physical resistance. Both of those do contribute to keeping him alive, but he doesn't really have a whole lot of tank stats outside of that. Damage at 3 is very fair, but it is an incredibly consistent 3. You have to play well to get it above there, and he is not a Hitmonkey Stealth Spidey level nuke, but his damage is extremely consistent, and it's probably not ever really going to feel like it falls much below this. Ease of use at 3, I think, is fair, maybe even a little bit on the low side, because honestly, you can just combo with Bullseye and get okay results, right? Guaranteed crits, never missing. There's a lot in this kit that just functions. But if you want to pull off the upper level, you do have to perfect release through a couple different special attacks and wiggle in that evade there. It's not that hard. We'll talk about it as we go, but 3 is probably about right. Like I said, maybe a little on the low side. He's not that bad. Utility of 4, I think, is very fair. Just literally never being able to miss is huge. Guaranteed crits is as much utility as it is damage in a lot of ways. And there are other things in his kit that we'll get to later, right? Solid utility. Additionally, defender strength of 4.5. This is the core of the kit, right? Bullseye was meant to cause problems on the right side of the screen, and he will. There are some ways to play around him to counter parts of his kit, but there aren't really hard counters to everything at the moment, and we will talk about that as we get there. That is the intention with roadblocks. Every time I make one of these videos, there's always comments that's like, so who's the best counter? Who's the hard counter? This person seems ideal, right? And there's always like 1 or 2 things missing. There are a couple quite good counters. Don't get me wrong, but the point here is to understand the threats in this kit and then try to mitigate them, not to just find the person who turns them off, because intentionally, that's not really a thing just yet. Moving on to strengths. Like we said, Bullseye can't miss. That's huge. Always on critical hits is also huge. That means that you're always ignoring 80% of armor and resistances on your hits. Cuts through a whole bunch of different threats. And then on the defender side of things, his specials are very difficult to dex. We'll talk more about that later, but you're gonna have to find an answer to them. Weaknesses, glancing does trump guaranteed crits, so you're gonna want to watch for that. It is a potent weapon against him, right? It's also, because of the ability accuracy reduction attached to it, going to stop his instant bleeds. Anti-evade makes it almost impossible to get his full ceiling on offense, and takes away a fair amount of his threat on defense, so big weakness there. And then a good chunk of his damage, especially as a defender, are those instant bleeds, so someone who is bleed immune goes a very long way. I'll just go ahead and say it because I know we're going to see it in the comments. Yes, Iceman does have anti-evade, and bleed immune, pretty solid. We'll get that out of the way now. Moving on to the actual abilities. Like we said already, all hits bypass miss, and all hits are guaranteed critical hits. These critical hits, and all personal effects, so all debuffs and passives, can be inflicted through blocks if those blocks are not well timed. And a lot of his stuff, like his specials, it's bluntly impossible to well-time block all of the stuff in his specials. And so this is more a way to mitigate the threat of his combos than it is to turn off the threats of his specials. I'm just going to call that. Bullseye is immune to precision and fatigue effects, so again, that's debuffs and passives, and includes the precision buff from the dexterity mastery, and instead gains a cruelty buff for 8 seconds when this immunity triggers, right? This buff will not re-trigger while already active, so you're not just going to constantly be gaining this buff, it's just every 8 seconds you can get a little bit of cruelty by dexing. When the opponent would be inflicted with a bleed effect, gain a cruelty passive for 8 seconds, and these are paused during special attacks. It's important to note that in this case, this refers both to when the bleed is applied and when it would be but is not for immunity, right? So these cruelties happen on the same triggers as his instant bleeds. But it's not only when they're prevented. I want to call that out because in the past we have used would be to only mean when they're prevented from actually happening. And in this case, this applies to both. These cruelties are also paused for 3 seconds when the opponent uses the dexterity mastery to avoid a basic attack. So you are probably going to be seeing longer ones in general when he's a defender. These max out at 10 stacks. Additionally, like we hinted at earlier, each cruelty passive increases physical resistance. At 10 stacks, this starts getting pretty significant. Blade attacks inflict instant bleeds, and these are also inflicted when an attack would be avoided with the dexterity mastery or an evade. So this is in his kit in-game, but blade attacks are basically his first medium, his first light, his second medium, so medium, light, medium, all 3 hits, and then just a bunch of hits in his special attack. That's what you need to know, right? I don't think it's really worth memorizing anything beyond the fact that it's medium, light, medium. Moving on, Bullseye also has dialed in, which means yes, he does have perfect release. So similar to Hawkeye or Kate Bishop, during a special 1 or 2, you press the block input after the first hit has landed to slow down time, and then you release it precisely when the final projectile is thrown, and you get a perfect release bonus. The is thrown part looks a bit different for him than for Kate or for Clint. It is when the projectile leaves his hand, kind of as the hand crosses in front of his body. There is a glint similar to the 2 Hawkeyes, but it is a little bit harder to pick out through his animations, and so you might have to play with this a little bit to get the timing, but once you get it down, I do personally find it fairly consistent. And as with them, you can just not let go of the left side of the screen after you click the special button, and you can hold it down until that moment, then release and get the perfect release without slowing down time. That is still an option. Of course, Special 3 minigame also gives you this perfect release. And as with the Hawkeyes, I'm pretty confident that I'm remembering correctly that you cannot lose a perfect release bonus. You cannot lose a dialed in with the Special 3. That one is all upside. So, activating a perfect release bonus grants an indefinite dialed in passive, increasing the potency of cruelty passives, and then re-triggers all your personal cruelties so that you benefit from that increase right away. If you fail to activate the perfect release, then you lose a dialed in passive. As with the Hawkeyes, they stack up to 5. As a defender, you have a chance to activate perfect release for each cruelty passive. But this is after Special 1 and 2, so it won't affect the damage of that special, but it will potentially put you in a bit more of a pickle after the special. And if you happen to run into Bullseye's Special 3 on defense, it's a guaranteed perfect release. Killer Instinct. This is the evade section. Gaining a bar of power grants a non-stacking Killer Instinct passive for 3 seconds. This will not trigger while already active, and it is paused during Bullseye's special attacks and while over 1 bar, or until a personal evade triggers. So that's a lot of pause information, and we want to unpack that for a second, because 3 seconds doesn't actually sound like that much time, but because this happens when you gain a bar, you are always going to be, by default, above a bar of power when it triggers. So this will start paused. That's the important part. And then, when you either throw a special, dropping you below a bar of power, or cause an evade, either of those is going to unpause this, and then it lasts for 3 seconds from that point, right? Now, while this is active, he has a 100% chance to evade incoming basic attacks, purifying any stun debuffs, not passives, in the process, and this evade will not trigger while blocking. None of these effects are affected by ability accuracy reduction, so you cannot get around Bullseye's evade with slow, decelerate, or somebody like Falcon. Combine these two things together, and it means that basically you will cross a bar of power, get this effect, and then the idea is you don't use it, right? You keep playing as normal until you want to throw a special, and then you will either drop your block, let your opponent come in at you, or maybe they're hitting your block because they have a special and you don't want them to throw it. Then you drop your block when they go for a heavy attack, or if you're fast enough in between their basics, and then that triggers the evade. That's going to be a key skill to master with Bullseye, is how do I safely trigger my Killer Instinct evade? And we'll get into why you care so much about that in a little bit. So when Killer Instinct expires as an attacker, it goes on cooldown. So you have to earn it back or wait some time. You don't just constantly have the evade, right? But note that is only as an attacker. As a defender, there is no cooldown. You have to deal with it. When evading, Bullseye counterattacks, and that is important because if you're not super familiar with counterattacks, that means that the evade itself has a hit event in it, which includes a hit stun, allowing him to follow up on that, right? You can use counter evades to start combos. It will land one hit, and then you can do your full medium, light, 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 medium, right? This is also very important because it means that if you trigger this on defense, it's not like Spider-Man's evade, where you can just trigger it and move on. Triggering it means you're going to get hit unless you have like an evade or something to avoid the counterattack hit, because that is valid. And often you are going to eat a full combo. So you really want to have a way to deal with the evade. This also is going to inflict an instant bleed, consider it a blade attack. And after counterattacking as an attacker, Bullseye's Special 3 is disabled for a second. This is important for reasons we'll get to later. As a defender, he's just much more likely to activate a special attack. So like I said, you're probably going to be in trouble if you trigger this, because it happens when he has a bar, and so you've probably activated it when he has a bar, right? Special attacks 1 and 2, activating either immediately after the counterattack, makes the first hit of the special attack unblockable. This is important because it is possible to actually cancel out of your counterattack by pressing the special button too quickly. And so this unblockable passive makes sure that your special lands. That's a nice little bonus for you, and also for a defending Bullseye. And grants a chunky Fury passive for 6 seconds. This Fury passive doesn't re-trigger while already active, and is paused during special attacks. That is very important because, as we talked about above, triggering Bullseye's counter evade allows you to lock your own Special 3, and therefore throw a Special 2 to get this Fury, and then you will still have a full bar ready below that, allowing you to follow up on the Special 2 with the Special 1. Because, as we'll get to later, Special 2 stuns. Additionally, I said earlier it is very, very difficult for an attacking Bullseye to unlock their maximum damage against somebody who turns off evade. This last line in this paragraph is the way around that, because intercepting the opponent with a special attack also grants this Fury passive. Now, a reminder, for characters that do not cheat, intercepting with a special requires the actual first hit to make contact with the opponent during either their dash animation or their first medium animation. So you cannot, most of the time, just dash back and throw this, because often when you do that against a charging opponent, they will finish their medium and enter their first light attack. That's why Black Panther and Venompool sometimes have problems. But Bullseye's special attacks are fairly explosive, and so this really is not that difficult to do. You can do this instead of the evade if something is stopping you from using that, right? Additionally, special attack hits landed against an invisible, phasing, or untouchable opponent grant no power. So somebody who is trying to cause Bullseye to miss, like Kitty Pryde, is not going to be gaining any power from him landing those hits anyway. So, Special 1 gives you a true accuracy passive for 15 seconds. It's paused until the end of that special attack. This is only that first special attack, right? It's not paused during all specials. You just aren't losing any duration for that first one. And then the final hit inflicts 2 additional instant bleeds, so 3 total, each dealing the usual damage. Those 3 instant bleeds are important because that means that you get 3 cruelties, remember? It also potentially is giving you 3 bonuses to your physical resistance. Special 1 can ramp that quickly if you've otherwise been having some trouble making that happen. Special Attack 2, on activation you get an impact passive. This is more important on defense than on offense. You can try and lean into it on offense a bit, but definitely more a defender thing. Reminder, impact just grants block penetration. So it's basically 1/2 of what Pierce does. It doesn't bypass armor. Bullseye's critical hits do that. It just gets through block proficiency. Will also inflict a non-stacking 50% bleed vulnerability passive, making all of your instant bleeds 50% stronger. Both of these last 30 seconds, and again, are paused until the end of the special attack where they activate. Plus, final hit of the Special 2 inflicts a stun passive. It's not a long one, but it allows you to get up in personal and hit your opponent, which is important if, like you said, or like we said earlier, you already have a bar of power or are close to it, because then you can immediately follow up your Special 2 with a Special 1, which is going to allow you to do a bunch of damage, right? Because the fury from evading or intercepting with a special is paused during special attacks, so you probably still have it here. But the other thing to keep in mind is this is another opportunity to get a dialed-in passive and improve your cruelties even further. So if your opponent happens to not be dead after all of this, then you're doing more damage to finish them off then. Additionally, I want to remind people, earlier in the kit, Bullseye's personal effects can be inflicted through block. If those blocks are not well timed, that means that this stun can happen through block, both as an attacker and a defender. So that's a potent key on offense to make the Special 2 a little bit safer. It also means you do not want to block the final hit of this special against a defending Bullseye. So moving on to the Special 3, this inflicts a disorient passive. It's a pretty chunky one, reduces defensive ability accuracy by 50%, lasts 45 whole seconds, and during that 45 seconds, all personal cruelty passives are paused. So basically what this means is you don't have to worry about dropping below 10 cruelties. Moving on to the signature ability, activating a special attack reduces damage caused by the opponent by 99.45%, basically about 100%, for 0.06 seconds. A reminder that our game functions under the hood on 30 frames per second. 0.06 seconds is 2 frames, so this is going to prevent damage on the frame where you activate your special and immediately afterwards, allowing you to catch both real power stings and Scorpion's fake power stings, and therefore is just really solid against a lot of annoying science defenders, right? Additionally, it is a tight window, so I would not recommend trying to use this to get around other large sources of damage, like, say, Gallon's Harvest. But I'm sure we will see videos of people playing shenanigans with it all the same. Additionally, when either champion is stunned or struck by a heavy attack, note this stun does not refer only to debuffs, so it also includes the passive from Bullseye Special 2. Bullseye has up to a 50% chance to purify 50% of all of the debuffs, up to a maximum of 10, and the stun debuff from the Parry Mastery will not trigger this. So any other stuns will, on either champion, but not parry, right? Still, that means that you can parry your opponent with Bullseye and then heavy attack, and you're probably going to parry stuff, or you're probably going to purify stuff, right? That can be helpful if you're using Bullseye with the recoil masteries. For example, get rid of that poison nice and early. So before we move on to synergies, I know this was covered for the most part in the deep dive, but let's dive into it a little deeper. I'm sorry. Bullseye's optimal cash out for his damage involves building to not all the way to 3 bars of power. You don't need to for reasons we'll get to in a second, but close to 3 bars of power, well over 2, and then you're going to want to trigger his evade. Like I said earlier, if on the way up here you've given your opponent a bar of power, you don't necessarily have to drop block and let them come in. What I often found myself doing was blocking, the opponent would come in. If you're fast enough, you drop the block right then as they've committed to the dash animation. Otherwise, you probably wait for them to throw a heavy and then drop your block for the heavy, because that will cause the evade. Then, when the evade triggers, you're going to throw your special 2, you're going to get your perfect release, it's going to stun the opponent, you charge in, you do maybe a medium, light, medium, into the striker that you have ready by this point because you have a relic on your Bullseye. That's going to do just a little bit more damage while you still have that big fury from the counter evade. And then you are going to take stock of how much duration is left on your fury, right? And you can do another combo of some length off of the striker opening into your special 1. Just make sure you activate the special 1 before the fury expires, because you want it to stay paused through the special 1, get perfect release again, and then if your opponent's not dead, well, now you have 2 dialed in passives and all your cruelties are better. The reason I said you don't need to build all the way to 3 bars, even though that is really cool looking, because you get the special 3 disable and you get to throw special 2, special 1, is because when the special 2 stuns, it allows you to hit the opponent and gain additional power. Like I said, if you have a striker, you can land like a full combo and a half. So you do not need to be that close to 3 bars of power to get the full special 2 striker special 1 cash out. The thing with Bullseye is because his hits are guaranteed crits, and because crits themselves ignore armor and resistances to such a large degree, his damage is really consistent. And so you can figure out and then rely on for different opponents what variations on that cash out you need. For some opponents, just doing 2 special 1s is going to be all you need, right? Because you'll get the big furies on the special 1s, you'll build to like a bar and a half, and then special 1, and then another special 1 is going to be all you need. For some opponents, you're going to need the special 2, and then you immediately throw the special 1. You don't bother with any hits or strikers or anything. You just take advantage of the fury you have. For some opponents, you're going to need the full special 2, the striker, the combo in between, the special 1, and then maybe still some cleanup. But that's going to be something that you can discover and figure out on a matchup-to-matchup basis to really take Bullseye to the next level. Additionally, we've talked about him a lot as an attacker. I know I do need to spend some time with him as a defender. His specials are painful, right? And you want to learn how to parry his basics so that you're not also taking a ton of bleed damage just baiting out his specials. But that's assuming that you haven't been able to bring a good counter, right? Because in general, you want somebody who is resistant or immune to bleed so that you are not just constantly taking damage while you're trying to dex Bullseye's basics to get him to throw his specials. Still, until he gets to a bar of power, make sure that you are parrying on the way in. Unless it's a hard knock life or something, even if he's stun immune, you want to parry and then re-parry to avoid those bleeds and avoid giving him cruelties. Once he gets to a bar of power, you want to be very careful to back off, right? Because him still being stunned from your parry won't save you. He will purify the stun debuff. You want to use somebody who either has an evade counter or who replaces purified stun debuffs with passives, like Storm, Bishop, Onslaught, right? The thing is that the Killer Instinct passive won't go away until he throws a special or activates an evade. So just hitting him while he's passive stunned is not going to get around it. You need to continue to be careful there. But that does just give you that much more freedom, and then you can try and bait out the special 1 or push to the special 2 if you're more confident in that dex. That's going to be a lot easier with somebody who can actually passive stun. And then you want to deal with that special, which we'll get to in a second, and then hit him again until you get to his next bar of power. This is why having an evade counter, which, reminder, cannot be ability accuracy reduction based, this is why having an evade counter is so potent against him, because you just do not have to worry the same way about allowing him to throw his specials to diffuse his own threat. Now, the specials themselves, the special 1 I don't think is fully possible to dex. I certainly never got it while we were playtesting. It's possible that it is, right? But what I found I could do with the special 1 was, as long as you have somebody who's bleed immune or resistant, I could evade all but 2 hits and parry one of those, and that kind of seemed to be minimum damage, minimum ramping from Bullseye. So you can learn that. There are also ways to parry a bit more of the special 1, but they're very tricky. The block stun on it is tough with just how fast-paced the special is, and so I don't personally recommend really trying to parry that many hits in it, unless you absolutely have to, because you feel like you're just going to be fighting him all the time without bleed immunes or characters with bleed resistance, right? Now, the special 2 is actually possible to fully dex. It takes some learning. The double psi throw towards the end and then the final grenade are the things that I found the most difficult to get down, but you can get them down, and then you have a full dex there, right? Again, you want bleed resistance so that you're not being punished for evading the rest of his special. But if you can push him to the special 2, and then you have that dex down, you can end up taking less damage that way. It's all mitigation, right? There is not currently someone who just truly shuts off everything he does without thinking about any of it. But we already mentioned Iceman. There are a couple others that do handle him pretty well, and that is why he's a 4.5 instead of a 5, to speak to that. The thing with him to remember is, even if you're giving up on fully dexing them, you want to make sure that you still practice them so that you can mitigate how much damage you take from them, because that is going to be the key in surviving a fight against him. Alright, now let's get on to the synergies. We have a basic Dark Avengers one here, perfect block chance, that's the old teammates. We have Eye for an Eye with Hawkeye and Kate Bishop. Dialed in passives increase the duration of their effects by an additional 3%. This means that on top of the 50% that Hawkeye and Kate give themselves, you can get up to another 15. So Kate, for instance, her effects are 12 seconds. Her own dialed-in passives at max stacks can take them up to 18. This is going to give you another, I think, 2.4 or something. I may have done the math when this synergy was tuned a little bit differently, but the idea is it will take these to around 20 seconds, if I'm remembering correctly, and make their upkeep just that much easier. Black, white, and red all over, very dark synergy name with the Daredevils and Elektra. Basically, if Elektra's knocked out, Daredevil gets a permanent 20% Fury buff. If Bullseye's knocked out, Elektra gets a Precision buff. And if the Daredevils are knocked out, then Bullseye gets a Cruelty buff. So all of these are permanent. They're just better for the whole fight, right? Somebody on your team has to be knocked out for this to happen, so it's a decent effect. Did we just become best friends with the Deadpools? They start each fight with an indefinite meat armor buff. So this is an armor buff, right? It grants armor rating. It also grants block proficiency, but I'm pretty confident that the point of calling this an armor buff is that it is, under the hood, an armor up, and it does protect you against Havoc, if you happen to care about that. This buff is removed if Deadpool is struck by a projectile or inflicted with bleed. So if you use Deadpool against Havoc, I guess don't get hit by his specials. And then Bullseye, block penetration increases by 5% for each personal cruelty passive. Thankfully, this will never be active on defense, but this does allow you to try and punch through block a bit more, play into the impact passive on the special too, maybe use the Valkyrie relic for a particular fight, right? Picture perfect with Cyclops. Cyclops can get a Fury buff by intercepting the opponent with his beam attacks, and then Bullseye gets a Fury if an attack doesn't critically hit against a non-mutant. So if you're facing somebody like future Ant-Man, and your attack glances, then you will get this Fury and do more damage past it, because the Fury itself is not affected by ability accuracy reduction out of necessity, right? Because the only way Bullseye is going to not critically hit somebody, at least in the current game, is if it glances. And that's Bullseye. There's quite a bit to talk about because he's a defender, right? And defender kits tend to be on the more complicated side, but he's also an interesting attacker, right? I mentioned already his damage is not like nuke worthy, right? He's not just going to blitz down any opponent. And so you are going to need to work a bit to make him a really effective attacker in Battlegrounds. But in Battlegrounds, he's probably often going to be on defense. And outside of that, where speed is less critical, I think you'll find Bullseye very consistent and effective. And he's going to be a valuable add to most people's teams. Hope you all enjoyed this. Let me know what you think in the comments. And until next time, thanks so much for watching, and take care.